Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for staying the course. I think we've had a really fascinating day today, covered a huge amount of topics and information about Latin America. So this is the final panel session, but we have a very important closing session to follow on from that with Leopoldo Lopez. So in this panel, we're going to be talking about critical infrastructure, we're going to be talking about critical minerals, but crucially, we're going to be talking both about the opportunities, but also some of the threats, and about facilitating international cooperation. My name is Fiona Clowder. I have a long interest in Latin America. I originally led on Latin America in the Foreign Office in London. I then went as ambassador to Chile. I then became the regional ambassador for Latin America and the Caribbean on COP26. I now work in the private sector, still on Latin America and net zero, and I'm very interested in the interface of mining and energy and environment issues. But perhaps if I can first turn to each of my panel members to introduce themselves. Randy.
Well, thanks, Fiona, and thanks, RUSI team, Carlos, Bianca, and the rest of the RUSI Latin America team for all the support and putting this together, because it is a major, major lift, as everyone can see here. My name is Randy Pestana. I serve as Director of Cybersecurity Policy at Florida International University's Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy. There we have 4 key pillars, one on education and training, another on research, international capacity building, particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, and as well as the Balkans, and of course, looking at community engagement, so events like these to bring differing perspectives all together towards common solutions. So excited to be here, excited for the conversation.
Good afternoon. I am Alison Treppel. I am the Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism, CICTE, because it's just an easier acronym, excuse me, of the Organization of American States, the OAS. I think I may have the pleasure of being the sole international civil servant participating in today's panels. I am a proud and long-standing multilateralist. I have been at the organization for, let's just say, many, many years. And I am very much committed to the mission and ideals of the OAS. Within CICTE, the Inter-American Committee Against Terrorism, yes, our primary mandate is to prevent and counter terrorism in all of its forms and manifestations. But within our department, which today has got about 55 staff members serving the Americas, we work in 4 core pillars. One is cybersecurity, the other is coordinated border management, land, air, and sea borders. We handle disarmament and non-proliferation of chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. And then our general prevention shop, where we look at violent extremism that is conducive to terrorism, terrorism finance and proliferation finance, and just general policies and strategies for preventing and countering terrorism throughout the region. It's really a pleasure to be here, again, representing CICTE and the OAS, and a special thanks to RUSI and the organizers for including us here today. And thank you all for sticking around for the last panel.
My name is Pedro Burelli. I'm probably the odd duck in this day. I come from the private sector as an investment banker for JP Morgan for many years, dealing with Latin America. My last job there was as head of private equity for the whole region. After that, I left to be on the board of Petróleos de Venezuela. At that point, the largest corporation in Latin America, contributing about 83% to Venezuela's exports and 50% of the GDP. Then considered the second best run state-owned company in the world after Saudi Aramco, a company that had the ability to fund itself with, no problem, credit rating 8 levels above the sovereign, which was our shareholder, and have watched over this 25 years how it's being gutted, it's worth nothing, and obviously has a lot to do with the situation in Venezuela. I continue to be mostly focused on my private business consulting activity, but I've always been involved by virtue of the fact that I ended up stuck in Washington dealing with the issue of Venezuela with the US government, with the US Congress, with the OAS, with the World Bank, IMF, IDB, and obviously with all the diplomatic corps involved in Washington and the think tanks in Washington. It's been extremely frustrating to see that things that one predicted early on in 2002, 2003 is exactly what's happened. I always say that in my business practice, I like to be correct. In my political predictions, I wish I had been wrong. And I wake up every morning and said, I cannot believe this continues to deteriorate. I'm not a member of any political party. I'm clearly in the opposition in Venezuela, but very independent. So I don't speak for anybody. I've never represented anybody from the opposition, although I'm very close to the person that you're going to see listen to next, and to Maria Corina Machado, who has now been selected as the opposition's leader for an eventual election, which I don't think is going to occur. I have the distinct feature of being banned from going back to my country. I have 2 bans, each one of them for 200 years, concurrent. So, I mean, it's until the year 2213 and until the year 2214. I have this ban, so I assume that in the year 2215 I'll return and see what's left of it. But in a serious note, I'm very happy to be here. I think we've discussed a lot of issues. I've seen how the panels have basically verged into all kinds of things, and maybe it's also an opportunity here to see if we've left things that have not been said in addition to just a title. So I'm looking forward to your direction, Fiona. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pilar. I am a senior researcher in AthenaLab. I'm very happy to be here and share this panel with all of you. I work with AthenaLab since 2 years ago. My focus is organized crime, illegal economies mainly. Infrastructure, resources, energy are very important topics in that research. Before that, I worked 10 years in the Ministry of Defense. I worked with the US mainly, in charge of the bilateral relations between Chile and the countries of North America and Asia Pacific. It's a big region, but the US was the one that gave me mostly all the job there, and I'm very happy to have the conversation this afternoon with you.
Thank you all very much. So before we get into talking more about the risks and how they could be mitigated, just to think first of all about the nature of infrastructure and the opportunity, and also about critical minerals in Latin America. So various reports have looked at what's the state of play on infrastructure in the region, and really progress is lacking compared to many other regions in the world. I think a recent IDB, Inter-American Development Bank report, identified that there's a big gap of around 2.5% of GDP in actual infrastructure investment. So there needs to be acceleration of that investment, because that in turn is important for the future economic growth of the region, productivity, confidence of business to invest. It can either be a virtual or a vicious cycle. But of course, to address some of that, both needs political stability, it needs vision about regulations and the institutional frameworks to make all this happen. And crucially, it also needs to make sure that the investment is resilient for the long term in infrastructure, both climate resilient as well as against other risks. It needs a sustainable investment environment, and it means there needs to be confidence, which means also about addressing some of those problems which we've been touching on today, about organised crime, about corruption and other security risks. So, Pedro, can I first of all turn to you, given your investment background? Can you say a little more about how you see the investment opportunities and also issues in the region?
Well, the first thing I want to emphasize is something that I always told my bosses at JP Morgan, and I've always said to everybody, and it was mentioned in the first speech this morning. Latin America is huge. Latin America is very distinct. And Latin America has been very cyclical and volatile. So the real problem of trying to talk about the region is what exactly are we talking about? I say, and I've said many times, having worked in Europe, is that the difference between Mexico and Argentina actually feel bigger than the difference between Spain and Germany. And somehow we believe that, because we both speak Spanish, Argentina and Mexico are the same. No. There isn't enough of a standard-based development that the European Union has brought to the European countries, where this operating environment is stable to some degree, and there are standards. So what you have is a mismatch, and that mismatch shifts. I mean, it's long-term infrastructure projects require forward thinking, good government, good execution, access to finance. And that shifts all the time in Latin America. Okay, so the ability to do that, I mean, things go with fashion. I mean, you started building from Mexico, Colombia, and other countries, toll roads. You suddenly get devaluations, inflation, stuff like that. Suddenly, toll roads are no longer economic. They get built, but nobody makes money in them. We now have ports. I mean, clearly Latin America, from any definition, is resource rich, and the world wants and needs what Latin America produces. So port infrastructure is now the big thing. For a long time, that port infrastructure was being done commercially by some of the big port companies. Now the Chinese are the ones who are coming in with very, very easy money. The little side point is that most of these ports are dual-use ports. Ports that can very easily be converted. In China's obsession with the US, and the Chinese don't understand why the US has a physical presence all over the world, and military bases all over the world. In their vision of being a superpower and eventually overtaking the US as a superpower, they need ports in which they could either visit or actually remain. So what you're beginning to see, if you actually see infrastructure right now, it is exactly what Latin America needs. It's export ports. Those get connected to rail, get connected to roads, to wherever the materials are coming from. But it's the Chinese who are moving very, very fast in that piece of infrastructure. It's difficult, therefore, to say disengage from China when what they're offering is what these countries need in order to power their exports of whether it's agricultural goods or minerals. First thing. The second thing clearly is mining. And many of these countries have abundant resources, in some cases rare earth, iron ore, alumina, gold, copper. And the issue here is, if large companies come, on a whole, they're probably going to respect the environment. It is either because it's within the nature of the corporation, or it's very bound in the financial agreements of whoever funds it, and whether it's the IFC, the IDB, or the CAF, all of them come in with a package that actually guarantees that these projects are sustainable. The issue is the growth of illegal mining. Not only does that not conform to anything, but it's actually the opposite. It's unsustainable, it's destructive, it damages the environment, damages the communities, it's untraceable, it's illegal, and it brings and supports criminal activity. And that, sadly, is growing at a faster pace than legal mining. And it's, you take the Amazonia region, that's 9 countries, 7 million square kilometers. It's in all of those countries, the exploitation of the minerals is growing all on the illegal side and very little of it on the formal, well-built. The final thing is communications. Clearly, the internal communications, this region continues to be a region that relates to the world, but doesn't really talk to each other. I mean, an Argentine will try to get to Miami, but not to Santiago. A Chilean, might go to Peru, but will never go to Mexico. So it is hub and spoke. Each of these countries deal with the US and Europe and China on their own, but they have not built anything that keeps them together. Therefore, some of the infrastructure that would be needed, railroads, roads, more airports, more hubs in the area to make it easier to move around, that's something that's way behind. But I believe it tracks the inability of Latin America to create a political or economic union.
So we've really got two sides of a coin here. We've got both the infrastructure needs and drivers in the region. We've got the enormous mineral resources which the world is going to desperately need and urgently need. I think often we forget that time frame in which we need to address climate change. The next decade is crucial. Mining takes a long time, so circa 20 years from discovery, and a lot of that through to production. A lot of that is to do with the permitting, both environmental issues, but community engagement. As you're saying, there's then needed the infrastructure to develop that, as well as other exports, particularly important on the food side and the exports from the region. And to facilitate all of this, you need good comms. So can I turn to each of the panel now to talk about more about what can actually be done about some of this, and what role can technology play both in facilitating that, but perhaps also in itself providing some of the risks that need to be dealt with. Randy, do you want to start with some comments?
Sure. Thank you. And Pedro, thank you for setting those settings. Because I think when we think about critical infrastructure, there's really four components to it. First, one must define critical infrastructure. And if you look across the Western Hemisphere, countries define it differently. The U.S., we define it as 16 critical infrastructure sector. Mexico, it's 10. Brazil, I forgot what the number is. Luis can tell you more specifically. But we're defining critical infrastructure differently, which means when we go to step 2, which is the building of said infrastructure or the control of said infrastructure, now you're having different conditions on the ground that creates unique and nuanced approaches depending on if you're in the Southern Cone or in Central America. And then where my area really focuses in on more is the protection of critical infrastructure. And I think this is where technology has already started to play a role. I know artificial intelligence often gets a bad rap about the potential vulnerabilities associated with artificial intelligence. But using AI, which we all do without knowing, we do intrinsically, right? The ability to not receive 1,000 spam emails every day or phishing attempts every day is due to artificial intelligence weeding it out. How do we integrate these emerging technologies into existing systems while also recognizing that we have a non-technology problem, which is a people problem? The inability to successfully train, retrain, or create the national culture of awareness around cybersecurity vulnerabilities that will in turn protect these critical infrastructure sectors. But there's a few other players. Obviously, there's understanding the multilateral community's role, understanding the private sector role, especially, right? Because in the United States, over 80% of our critical infrastructure is controlled by the private sector. So there has to be communication mechanisms and mechanisms for information sharing that allows critical infrastructure not to be fully protected, because it's never going to be protected as long as it's connected, but to create a level of resiliency that ultimately will be long-lasting and spur economic growth and investment within the countries.
Alison, would you like to comment on some of the links of all this to organised crime and threats?
Yeah, no. Well, Randy did a fantastic job introducing the topic, I think. I mean, that is the crux of critical infrastructure protection. I would maybe just add that it has evolved a bit. So when we're looking at critical infrastructure protection now, regardless of what you call it, whether it's critical infrastructure, critical information infrastructure, in essence, we're looking to protect our physical and digital assets. And to Randy's point, fortunately, many countries in the hemisphere have defined their critical infrastructure or their essential services, but just as many have not. And it may seem like a small detail, but until you have clarity on what those services are that are deemed critical for your country's operations, you really can't put in motion any of the other actions that need to happen. Your threat assessments, your strategies, your planning, your operations, building of new infrastructure. And so that's really a critical first step. We obviously, as I mentioned in my introduction, everything I do and what my team does is through a terrorist lens. But when we look at critical infrastructure protection, we cannot work in a silo like that. I mean, you have to look at however the incident may happen, whether it's through man-made, a terrorist attack, work of an organized criminal group through a cyber attack, or a natural disaster, your preparation and response should be very similar, if not the same, quite honestly. And so I think as we continue this panel discussion today, what you're going to hear me say really repeatedly, and in fact, I would even hope that you would all go to bed tonight just saying preparedness and resiliency. I mean, resiliency here is really the crux of the matter, because as much as I would like to say the work that we're doing is to prevent incidents, that's not going to happen. Incidents, attacks, hopefully not significant, it's going to happen. They are going to happen. Prevention, forget about it. The best that we can hope to do is to prepare, to understand the situation, to take measures, put them in place to ensure, again, that we are resilient. And in fact, I would take it a step further, and you'll hear me talk about in just a bit some of the work that we're doing. But really, the new mentality now is when an attack happens, because again, whether it's a cyber attack, whether it's against your transportation sector, energy, what have you, the goal is not to bounce back from that incident, but now to bounce forward. So to learn from that experience and at the same time plan ahead, right? To be a step ahead of the game. What's coming down the pike? What have we learned from this? What are the new threat actors or new threats? And continually prepare in advance.
Thank you, Alison. I'm sure we'll want to pick up on some of that. Really interesting. Can we go to Pilar now?
Well, I would like to stay with a concept that Alison said. She said we need to prepare and plan ahead. And in the case of Latin America, and specific in the threat that organized crime is for infrastructure, for technology, for connection and cooperation in not only in Latin America, in the whole world, we need to be prepared because all the concepts that Pedro talked about, rails, roads, ports, mining, good government, political stability, we need them all to have a good development of our states, but these kind of groups, these criminal groups, needs also, all of them, to develop their business. And in Latin America, they are exploiting the gaps that we have. They are using the infrastructure that we have. For example, in the case of Chile, they're looking our ports to export their illegal products. They are searching for new businesses and new business opportunities. And in the case of mining, it's a very good example in Latin America, but also in Chile, they look for resources, for minerals, for example. They are exploiting the illegal economy of copper, of wood, of fish. They are using our infrastructure, and we need to be prepared. And in that case, we need to build institutions. We need to strengthen them and strengthen the cooperation between, not only inside the countries, between institutions, but between countries. Pedro said that Latin America, even though we see it as a whole, is very different. Each country is a whole story, very, very different, even though from their neighbor also. So we need to understand that difference, and we need to work with them so we can build this cooperation and strengthen the communication between countries and the efforts. Because when we talk about illegal mining in Latin America, we're talking about organized crime. And if we see organized crime in Latin America, we're talking about drug cartels. And when we talk about drug cartels, we immediately need to see what's going on in East Europe, for example, or in Australia or in Asia regarding the use of drugs. So we are all connected. It's not that we only need to develop the cooperation in Latin America, and we not only need to strengthen the state and the institutions, but we need to strengthen the whole cooperation system around the world, because these kind of groups will be continue exploiting our vulnerabilities, using our gaps, and finding the business opportunity, because they are criminal enterprises that find their strength in political weakness, instability, lack of good government. They use corruption to penetrate the state. And when all that elements are together, resources, infrastructure, society, and everything else is on risk.
So this challenge of both developing the infrastructure, but that in itself can actually facilitate many of the wider problems and actually fuel that vicious cycle leading to further political and economic instability. And Pedro, we're starting to talk about cooperation here and about government's approach, but what about cooperation between governments and the private sector on these challenges?
Well, one of the interesting things that I think happened is that if there's an area where both American and European countries were invested, it was Latin America. But at some point, that diminished. If you look at direct foreign investment from the US, it just plateaus as they start going and looking at opportunities in China, Southeast Asia, even now in Africa, and consolidating their home ground, Europe and the US. So there is cooperation. There is pockets of Latin America that you would not know where you are. And if you go to the northern part of Mexico, to Monterrey, you actually believe you're in the US. I mean, there's nothing. There's parts of Colombia that over the years of stability that Plan Colombia brought to it was able to industrialize and move to what looked like the next stage. Obviously, pieces of Sao Paulo look like Germany or like Japan, I mean, for all practical purposes. The fact is that it is, very frustrating to see, and obviously looking at the region where you had three countries that were, pointing in the direction, which were Mexico, Colombia, and Chile, followed by, Peru and others, that suddenly had the ability that no matter, they kept, it was democratic, they were changing governments with relative frequency, but they were not changing policies with any frequency. So that stability allowed to build, resilient, strong infrastructure. And that takes a long time. To destroy that, it takes a very little time. I mean, it doesn't take any time to unwind one of these countries. And when I started by talking about Venezuela, the time it took Chavez to destroy the oil company, it took 100 years to build, almost to the time, and it was destroyed in 3 years. Once he fired half of the employees, and not just numerically half of the employees, but the best half of the employees, and we can demonstrate that that was the case, because we had very good human resources, and we knew the evaluations of those people who were fired. It was very vindictive. They were going literally against those who they believed had been trained in the United States, had degrees in the United States, were really, really competent. So from the early days of Chavismo in Venezuela, this big piece was broken. And this is a lesson in Argentina. When you privatize and then you renationalize and you go back and forth. So it's very difficult for the private sector to contribute and contribute in a consistent way. Are there opportunities? Are there a lot of companies who would like to be there? Yes. We have this little spurts of growth in private equity activity. In fintech, in other places, you start seeing, and that's taking advantage of talent that exists in the region. It doesn't really involve a lot of investment. It just simply is how do you marshal the talent that's sitting there, that's ready to do stuff. Now, another problem that's sad is that if these countries do not develop stable things, you're beginning to see a massive brain drain of the people who the foreign sector would like to have as counterparts, beginning to leave, the young people finding out that if you're going to fund you're in Chile, but you want to fund a startup, you have to go to Mexico to fund it. You have to just run away from the region. And somebody, I think, there's Oppenheimer one day said, where's the Bill Gates from Latin America? And they're probably working for Microsoft. They're working for Apple in California or in Washington State. But the issue is that something is not clicking. The real concern, I pull out, at Georgetown where I teach, I pull out my iPhone and I said, okay, how many components does this device contain? They have no idea. Where do they come from? They have no idea. They ask, how many of them come from Latin America? The fact is that none of them come from Latin America. So we're somehow becoming marginalized from the flow of the main knowledge business, the main technology business, and therefore, yeah, I mean, there's power plants and hydro plants and mining, but a lot of the other sophisticated infrastructure for a new economy. I mean, this conversation that Randy mentioned right now about AI, I mean, you sit down and talk about AI, and AI applied for development, and applied for growth, and applied for protection, all that. In Latin America, it's like, the gap is just building. Every 6 months, the gap just gets like 2 years further back. That's a real challenge. And this, Fiona, I insist, is bad governance, but in reality, it's bad governance. It's the accumulation of bad governance. And when they're the good ones, they have so many problems to deal with that some of this stuff is luxury. They're barely holding on, until election comes in 3 or 4 years, and they're gone. We've got to break. I mean, what happened, what came to Europe, it's not collective government. I don't like the notion of collective government, but it was just competition from within, was standards, was an operating environment that made it very easy for everybody to raise the bar, and for everybody who was investing in the European Union know what they're expecting. That does not occur in Latin America, and I don't see it anywhere. As a matter of fact, I see that we're almost going backwards again, with more fragmentation in the region, with more frailty in politics, with highly polarized societies that do not provide a great environment for large-scale infrastructure projects. But, as Pilar was saying, it's a great environment for illegal business.
So an investment gap, a skills gap, and also I think a projection gap in terms of Latin America projecting out to the world what it's got to offer and attracting some of that investment. But I'd like to go back to Alison, and you were going to tell us more about actually preparedness as a very important part of resilience. Can you tell us more about ideal approaches and how you see this developing in the region?
Yeah, thank you. So I want to build a bit on what Pedro was saying, because I think we can all agree, certainly there are plenty of vulnerabilities, gaps, but the truth of the matter is we don't really understand what they are. Their perceptions, their educated guesses, but nobody has really looked at this issue. There has not been a lot of significant research or data collection around critical infrastructure protection. There's an IDB, an Inter-American Development Bank report that was done. It's about 8 years now. There's been some more recent work, my own included, on cyber, but when we look at critical infrastructure protection writ large, we really just don't know. So again, just through the work that our respective agencies do, we know there are a lot of sectoral strategy development. Again, I know there are a lot of cybersecurity strategies. There's targeted training in other areas. But across the board, we really don't have a good sense. So I would say there is where there's, for the researchers and even investment, this would be a good place for us. We need to have a baseline. We need to really understand what the situation is in our region. Because again, we can't generalize, not all 2 countries are the same. Nonetheless, what we believe is really the critical first step, again, regardless of the infrastructure that you're looking at, is a strategy development. If that's the only point that I have time to make today, it would be that. And again, the goal is not even the end product. Our goal is not just to have a document so we could say, look, we have a strategy. It's actually the process of bringing together the actors, your government actors, your different representatives of the industries, of government actors, your private sector partners, civil society, anyone, any key stakeholder who is involved in your critical infrastructure needs to be sitting at a table, figuratively or literally. Together, you need to map out what is the critical infrastructure. What is the threat landscape your area, your agency, your country is facing? We don't even think these conversations are happening. What are your priorities going forward? Again, we tend to be very in the moment, what's happening to us right now, but we really have to do some forecasting, some planning, some looking ahead, understanding how the threat landscape is evolving and targeting, at least, even if it's, you know, fluctuating, 2 to 5 years, looking out ahead. Identifying your resources. Nobody ever likes to talk about the money, right? But protection, critical infrastructure protection, it involves resources, both human and financial. And so here it has to be an ongoing effort. How can you attract those resources? Where is it coming from? I don't want to suggest private sector, but that is where a lot of the money is. But obviously there has to be something in it for them. Who are your human resources? Who's going to be involved? Are they trained? Are they adequately prepared to address these threats? And ultimately, and we'll continue to talk about this, is continuing those conversations, building the partnerships, the cooperation, the coordination, the trust and confidence that is so crucial for really any successful endeavor. And so we are aware, at least in the OAS, that this is a problem. So we are actually being discussed this afternoon, in fact, back up in Washington. We have worked to prepare a model framework strategy for countries. It's basically just says what I just said, right? I mean, it's a very simple document. Again, it doesn't have to be complicated, but it lays out the key elements of how governments should endeavor to protect their critical infrastructure from any hazard. Again, what I just talked about earlier, whether it's terrorist, an organized crime, an incident, a cyber attack, or a natural disaster. With climate change, this is not my expertise whatsoever, but again, just as a citizen of the world, we can obviously see how climate change is impacting natural disasters, the impact that that's going to have, the flooding, delays on transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So development of a strategy is the key starting point, at least. And I'll leave it at that for now.
And as part of that, Randy, do you want to say more about the cyber side of things?
Sure, and I think, you know, I'll say this probably about 10 times during this presentation. Alison's absolutely right? I mean, the strategy is a prerequisite at this point, right? And unfortunately, it's only just over half of the countries in the Americas that have a cybersecurity specific strategy. As the old saying goes, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So understanding where you're trying to go, what you're trying to protect, and then moving to phase 2, which I find is the more critical phase, which is the implementation plan, right? Who are your leads? You know, you don't have to go very far in Latin America. Let's start in Argentina to say, okay, who's responsible for cyber? And you're going to have 4 fingers point at each other until the resources come and then they're pointing at themselves, right? So understanding who is the lead for cyber defense, who's the lead for cyber operations, if you're going to have an offensive capability, who's the key partners for engagement and information sharing, what is the vehicles which you have for information sharing. But there's a lot of things out there that is openly available and easy to emulate, right? And going to, you know, Pedro's key area, information sharing, the financial sector does it better than any other sector, right? They have weekly meetings internationally. They have different groups and subgroups, regional groups that meet consistently, share information, and they're constantly targeted. I'll give you a small anecdote. A few years back, I was at Morgan Stanley Security Operations Center in New York, and they have a floor of just monitors of what's going on in the financial sector across the world. And if you look at the top 5 states globally that were being compromised, 4 of those were in Latin America, right? It speaks to the level of development that's occurring there, because it's much easier from a cost-benefit perspective for a cyber criminal to attack a developing country, like we're seeing in Latin America and Caribbean, as opposed to a more developed country, because it's more costly to get into the system. So let's take the lessons from the financial sector. Let's take the opportunity of the fact that countries are developing these strategies and these protections to build a robust and resilient infrastructure that allows you to protect against incoming and forthcoming cyber attacks.
Okay, before I open this up to questions from the audience, can I ask each of you to summarize given the political volatility in the region, the difficulty of the long-term agenda, who should be the conveners that actually make something happen? There's both conveners within individual countries, but there's also what can be done to facilitate cross-border cooperation, because many of these problems are themselves no respecter of boundaries. So who would like to give Pedro?
This is very frustrating because when you see any kind of institutional advance, I mean, the work Alison does, you know, it's not, I mean, it's a professional team working, but this is a conversation that doesn't really catch the governments. I mean, when you realize, you know, Lula comes back and when he wants to restart its CELAC on UNASUR, instead of strengthening what already exists, you know, saying they don't have money to support those institutions, but they want to dilute the ones that exist. So I actually think that in the politics and the ideological game, you know, by the way, ideological / version of the criminality of some of the behavior of some of the leaders of the region that make it very difficult for consensuses to arrive. I mean, they're constantly boycotting any of these types of conversations because they're keeping the conversations at a grievance and everything's the United States and this is the problem. They're not evolving. I think the countries, individuals, people within the country are leaving many of those countries because the governments do not evolve. It's very, you know, most young people do not, I mean, I was, you know, with this leadership program that we have, one of the phenomena is that a lot of people through YouTube actually watch the leaders that they would like to have in their country. They start living vicariously. And if they're lucky enough to get a job for Microsoft in Argentina or for Oracle in Peru or whatever, they kind of hide in this, they're living in a country, but in reality they're living as corporate citizens of the world, but dying to get away from countries in which these conversations are not taking place. I mean, it's, again, when I said about the lag of time in terms of the digital gap, just to call it some way, the thinking gap, the leaders, I mean, you would have conversations with President Duque and his view, and he was 100 years ahead of his counterparts. But, you know, he's left presidency with a really bad reputation. Okay? It's very difficult to get somebody like Duque elected in any country. Somebody whose vision, understanding, knowledge, his work in the IDB, I mean, he really was a leader that understood that. And we're getting people like Lula and Milei and others, and Boric, who have zero experience, zero vision of how to put this thing together. And the bureaucracies below are not powerful or permanent enough to compensate for bad leadership on the top. So when you talk about this is a constant thing, who do we get together to get this thing moving? It's hard because these are very top-down countries, and if the top is not working, the down is not working. So that's my...
Okay.
If I can challenge, and I do want to hear Pilar's view on this because we talked a little bit about this last night. In representative democracies, the idea of the population providing demands upon their leadership is critical, right? And in a field like cybersecurity, whether you don't understand it or scared to touch it because it's too technical or for whatever means, similar things in the critical minerals or the wood trafficking like you were talking about in Chile, there has to be a demand from the population upon their leadership to make effective change, right? And Costa Rica, while developing the strategy, and they were moving towards this, really fast forward a lot of their National Security Operations Center movement after being completely compromised and being on the front page, not just of the local news sources, but international news, right? So there takes often a fire for it to become a fire, right? And not praising President Bukele in El Salvador, that's not the intention here, but the biggest issue facing the population, the demands on Bukele were to combat the gangs by whatever means necessary. And he has done that in response to the population. So I think the larger question is, what will it take in lieu of a major cyber attack or a major fire that occurs in the country for the citizens to be proactive in informing their leadership? We demand that you do this or focus on these areas,
or else the political consequences are going to come from it.
But Randy, and good to be like, that doesn't even happen in the U.S. or Europe, okay? The citizens are not asking the U.S. Everything that has been done in the U.S. for cybersecurity, all that is really from the top down. I mean, there's no way the population, in terms of the demands, I mean, they wanted inflation to come down, a bunch of things. They want immigration to stop because they fear that they're going to lose jobs. I've never heard anybody said, where's our cybersecurity strategy? That doesn't happen.
Pilar.
Well, yes, we talked a little bit last night about that, but I can say that in Latin America, the problem is trust.
Yeah.
Because we all agree that we need to cooperate. We all agree that we need to share information, that we need to strengthen and secure critical infrastructure, work on cyber, in AI, use technology. But at the end of the day, we don't trust each other. We have very different ways of doing things. The political instability doesn't help with that. Only create a bigger gap. The change of ideology in the different countries also doesn't help. And in that way, I think that first we have to start talking about trust and how we will strengthen our mutual trust. Maybe start with little steps in order to put together common interests, work on them, and have a good result on that. And after that first good result, continue on the second and the third, because we need to build really, really solid foundations here, because we can lose trust in 1 second, and we will take a lot of time rebuilding it. So first of all, we need to talk about trust, and with that, talk about the strategies, the cyber, AI, technology, information sharing, because if we don't share information today, we cannot combat our transnational threats. And our transnational threats, they're not only moving from one country to another through land or air or sea, they're moving through the web, the dark web, the deep web. So we need to start building that trust, start sharing the information, but really sharing the information, and starting on common interest in order to build and develop strategies that will have good results in the future.
So in a way, taking risk on that trust, because also these challenges are growing ever faster, but also the real opportunity is there, particularly around the minerals agenda, which with more common trust, and trust is a big issue in mining itself, but with more transnational trust, actually the region could realise more of these opportunities as well as combating some of these cross-border
And it's
threats.
difficult with all this political stability.
Right. Alison, would you like to have, as it were, the
Yes.
last word from the panel, and then
Yes.
I'll open it for questions.
So I very much appreciate all of the inputs from my distinguished panelists, right? But again, I'm very clear from the beginning what my role is here, and I am going to remain the optimist with the glass half full, right? We have to have hope. Sin esperanza no tenemos nada. In terms of what good is any of this going to do, I would say, again, we have to just put the steps in place. At the end of the day, I remain committed to the fact that we are a reactive society. We will really do nothing until something bad has happened to us. It's as simple as that. And then when something happens, oh my God, what are we going to do now? That's never going to change. I don't think that will ever change globally, but certainly not in Latin America. So that's all I can say. All I can do is practice what I preach, which is to continue to preach preparedness and resiliency, putting the steps in place. The trust and confidence I also referenced. Nobody has an answer to that. There is no solution. The region looks wildly different today than it did even 10 years ago, 20 years ago. How do you build trust? How do you build confidence? The only way to do that is by talking, right? By having conversations, by building the relationships in person, right? We all took a hit through the pandemic too. Nobody was building relationships over the internet, right? So to this point, again, I'm not trying to plug what I do. I'm just sharing the experiences that we have had and what I think works. And so to this extent, we are trying to build networks of practitioners, of government authorities. We have a network of aviation security authorities. We have a network of CICTE, cyber incident response authorities. We have a network of major event securities. We were talking earlier at, FIFA World Cup, what happens around major event planning and that kind of critical infrastructure. A port security, right? We have a terrorism intelligence network, right? We just very much believe in the power of dialogue. Again, we're an international organization. This is what we do. We are conveners. We bring people together and foster that exchange. Has it solved every problem? No. But can I go to sleep at night knowing that we have tried to bring actors together, whether you are politicians or practitioners, and at least bring you to the table to get you talking, including civil society and private sector? We are trying. We are absolutely open to hearing ideas of, other successful experiences of what works.
So the power of talking and the power of ideas. So can I open this up to questions and ideas from the panel? Gentleman right at the back first, and then I'll turn to you, sir.
Yes, I want your opinion about two big problems in Latin America. The first one, Mr. Burelli was right when he talks about illegal mining, but there is another very big problem, is the radicals NGOs. They allied with the local left, and it's impossible to have new mining or gas or oil. There are two very big mines in Peru, Tia Maria and Conga, and it's impossible to build them. Also, Panama have a big problem right now with a big mine, a copper mine. Chile, they have also another problem. These people have a lot of money. They know how to use the press, have lies, have truths, a lot of lies. How could we stop these people? Because really we can develop a lot of mining in Latin America with this opposition. No? They are funded by a lot of money from Sweden, from Diakonos, from Miseor in Germany, the Oxfam here in Britain, and it's impossible to open new mines with these people. And the second thing that I want to hear your comments is about the Chinese money in infrastructure. For example, they own the electricity in Peru. They own all the big companies in Peru, and we are talking about state Chinese companies. And then they are building a very, very big port in the Pacific, in Shanghai, in the city of Shanghai. It's not Shanghai, it sounds like Shanghai, but it's very similar to Shanghai.
I'm going to have to stop you there because I'm keen to take another couple of questions.
What's your opinion about
we're going to run out. Okay, thank you. Gentleman here and then gentleman there, then I'll turn to the panel. And can you introduce yourselves as well, please?
Ewan Grant, former law enforcement intelligence analyst. I worked for an EU program for some years in Ukraine where I saw the corruption networks around, this is pre-Crimea, around the meat trade from South America to Russia through the Black Sea. And that was very much deep state stuff. So, and money on to the traditional tax havens through the usual transit nations, including the UK. My question is this, but is therefore based on that and beyond, the lessons of the JBS meat company hacked in the Five Eyes countries, not hacked in Latin America. Have there been case studies and after-action examinations on that? And I would just say, trust, trust, trust. Thank you for that. And it can't be done through an internet screen.
Thank you very much. And okay, we'll take two, and then we're going to have to turn to the panel to close on time. So gentleman there, and then the gentleman behind. Very quickly, please.
I'm intrigued by, this is my favorite session.
Thank you.
Wait till the end. Climate change and global security is so intrinsically linked, and this year is going to be the year that the International Seabed Authority is going to decide regulations for deep sea mining. And Latin America is a continent which is very divided on the Convention of Law on the Sea about where deep sea mining comes in. And you spoke about how we need to close this cycle for critical minerals, but they've shown that if we regulate deep sea mining, if we allow it to happen in the Pacific and the Atlantic, especially around Latin America, the effects of the carbon sink being drained, taking these polymetallic nodules out of the sea, will destroy our environment like we have on land. Latin America, especially Chile and Peru and Bolivia, have been exploited by the world on land. How can we stop that happening in the sea and protect the world?
Very interesting. I think could be the subject of a whole seminar on its own. Finally, the gentleman.
Very simple question to Alison, if I may. I think I heard you use the word violent extremism. I work in political violence, and we have a definition for terrorism: non-state actor, threat or use of force to achieve a political objective. What's the difference between a definitional difference between a terrorist and a violent extremist?
Okay, so we have a set of very comprehensive and fascinating questions there, but I think some themes coming out are about how you build trust again with communities and how you address environmental issues, how you address corruption, which can also be linked to major exports that are very important for the countries involved. How do you deal with this urgency of the need to extract and exploit minerals and the opportunities from deep sea, but huge differences between countries and their perspectives on that? And then finally, the difficult definition question between terrorism and violent extremism. So in 3 minutes, can you perhaps pick one of those themes and give a quick response? Randy, can I start with you?
I'll start with the gentleman's question, and I'm less familiar with the specifics of that case, although there are some consistencies across all cases that you can kind of take some assumptions from. One is understanding where the entrance of said attack occurred, right? Whether it was through individuals with administrative rights, vulnerabilities within the specific software, or other inherent vulnerabilities, again, with the specific sector, and what was open, what was not, particular to the network, right? And Willis Ware had a great saying back in 1967, prior to ARPANET, which was, the moment you're connected to a network, you're inherently vulnerable. So understanding, one, we're inherently vulnerable, but two, understanding what your attack surface looks like, who has access to your network, who has administrative rights within that network, and then what are the vulnerabilities from there. Second, it's looking at consistent patterns, right? If you look at OPM hacks, one thing we knew very quickly was that it was the Chinese conducting these attacks. Why? Because they have a consistent pattern and methodology in which they utilize and how they access that information. Similar with the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, and others. So understanding the pattern obviously allows us to narrow it down. But largely stated, most attacks, over 80%, are all crime-based, financial-based attacks. The reason for that is there's money to be made in the market, right? It's very easy to compromise a system, especially an unpatched system, or a system that gives everyone in their organization administrative rights to be able to shut it down, essentially launch a ransomware attack for you, and then get it very quickly $3,000 to $6,000 on average, right? So the people problem is legitimate because over 90% of all attacks come from an individual source, not a vulnerability within the software. So if you look at most cases, you're targeting an individual. You're targeting the individual that has administrative rights. You're smart enough to go into the database of employees to figure out the information of who is most likely to be compromised, and then utilize the puzzle scheme to fit the different pieces to find out the information.
Right. So basically a risk analysis.
Correct.
On top of that. Right, very quickly, I'm going to turn to Pilar, then Alison, and Pedro to close.
Okay, there was a question about stopping illegal mining from the gentleman in the back, and I want to stop in that point because you mentioned Chile, but when we see illegal mining in Latin America, we see, for example, the illegal mining around gold. But when we look at the case study of Chile, in Chile, when we talk about illegal mining, it's not so correct because we're not exploiting illegally copper, for example. The illegal economy around the minerals in Chile is linked to theft. They steal the copper in order to build this illegal company that laundry the mineral, laundry the money, and distribute and export the copper. That's different, for example, the case of Ecuador or Peru. But at the end of the day, where you find emptiness of power and you have an economic opportunity, there you will find illegal mining or this illegal economy. And the way to stop that is mainly trying to work with the private sector and the public sector also in order to strengthen the institutions and try to find where are the gaps and the windows where corruption could get inside in order to close those gaps and close those windows and fight this threat or challenge.
So again, identifying risks, vulnerabilities, building partnerships.
Yes.
Alison.
Well, of course, I'm going to respond to the violent extremism, to terrorism comment. So my official response is going to be, of course, there is no globally agreed upon definition of terrorism or violent extremism, but we all still know what it is, right? And I would say that the lines are getting murkier. And even at one point where we could clearly delineate between organized crime and terrorists is becoming increasingly murky, particularly in Latin America, whereas on the one case, certain activities used to be financially motivated, and others were more politically, ideologically motivated. I can no longer say that either. So ultimately, again, it comes down to sovereignty. Call it what you want, manage it. But when we are looking at what's happening in our region today, 5-7 years ago, even in discussions at the OAS, violent extremism was not a problem for our region. That happened elsewhere, and no one is saying that anymore.
Sad, but very true. And finally, Pedro, very briefly.
Well, very briefly, I want to say something on trust, because I think it's an overriding issue for Latin America. Francis Fukuyama is famous and infamous because of his book, The End of History. In reality, his best book is a following book, the one that he wrote on trust, that came right afterwards. And that's the book that actually explains the difference between developed and undeveloped societies. It is trust. Unless you have societies that are built upon trust, it's very difficult to create institutions, to pattern behaviors, to create stability. Trust is a completely absolute element, and I think societies with low levels of trust will have low level of development and all kinds of other related problems. On the issue of illegal mining, the activism, these activist groups that come from in the form of environmental activism and in the form of indigenous activists, obviously are being powered by the information technology. Everybody's connecting, finding out this worked in this country, we stopped this mine, let's use the same thing. So part of the problem of doing business right now is the same as doing politics right now, is that we're just cluttered with information and the speed of reaction of people is very, very fast, both legitimate information and disinformation. And in that kind of activism, you have both. Sometimes you have very legitimate causes to stop mines, sometimes it's just almost a fake news and the exaggeration for whatever interest is behind. The final thing I would say, given that you gave me the opportunity to give Latin America is in play. It's really, really in play. It's nobody's backyard. okay, in a multipolar world in which both of the kind of competing powers, the United States, Russia and China, tried to define multipolar as not unipolar, and each pole having its area of influence, the United States and Europe did not believe in that concept. So the concept in Munich in 2007 by Putin of defining the view of the world that he wanted, or of Xi and Putin in February of 2022, the United States and Europe does not buy that notion. The view of the world as they view it is not understood. Nobody has an area. The United States will sail in the South China Sea, Europe will defend Europe, and will defend any country that seeks support from Russia. That's going to happen. That makes Latin America a player. China and Russia will play in Latin America in every single way that they can. China has more tools to play legitimately, but they also will disturb. Russia is only a distractor, only will create chaos. They have nothing positive to add to the region, but they're going to play very, very hard. So as we look at the future of Latin America, this transnational crime, where does the Russian mafia start and the Russian state start? Where is that gap? You can't find it, okay? There's no way to find it. How much of what's happening, does Maduro's attitude towards Guyana, why does Russia support it? Of course they support it. Their single objective is to distract the United States, to create another focus of chaos. China will do anything it can to position itself in Latin America. Half of what they're doing is legitimate. Half of what they're doing is looking for resources, looking for markets for their products, looking for places to invest their excess money. The other half is probably very nefarious and goes into, is it terrorism? Is it state terrorism? I mean, when a state entity hacks you, is that terrorism in the normal way? Or is this kind of another form of war? So my sense is that if Latin America is at play, the conferences that we should have about it probably have to move into what does a hybrid war look like in the region and who can be the winner at the end. Because what's clearly is that nothing that happens in the South China Sea can be ignored in Latin America. Nothing that happens in Ukraine is not going to have an impact in Latin America.
So Latin America needs to be a player or be played.
Exactly.
So I think on that note, we're going to have to end this fascinating session because I know we have an excellent final session coming up. And I'd like to both thank Carlos Solar and the RUSI team here for a great day, but now to hand over to Carlos for this final session, and to also thank the panel. I think we could talk for many more hours on the fascinating topics that come up, and thank you very much for your questions.
Encantado de conocerte.